Why, hello, greetings to you and whatever time of day and time zone you're in. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to yet another live Q&A session. We always want to make sure that we're going into all the different ideas and concepts about Heilkunst, both in theory and in practice, how treatment works, and all these wonderful topics. And as always, if you are here with me live, you're certainly free to type in your question or your comment into wherever you're watching. There's going to be some kind of comment box, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, those kinds of formats. Or if you are watching this in the future as a recorded replay, you can actually do the same thing. Type your question into the box, and I will get that, and I will respond to it in the next video. Anyways, so that's where we're at. You can, as I say, you can type in your question, or the other option, if you're here with me live, depending on the nature of your question, you can ask to come into the studio with me, and then we can kind of be on camera together and have more of a conversation. If the nature of your question is a little bit more detailed and more interactive in that sense. So where I thought we could start today, let me just switch my screen over here, is kind of one of the most common questions. And it comes up in different formats and different contexts, but it's really coming down to the same root question here. And that is, what is the difference between curing and healing, right? We have two verbs, to cure, to heal. And I will give a good explanation of that. There is a difference there, but I think it makes a little bit of a better sense that we take a step back to give us more of a context for that question. And the step back I want to take is into our very basic word, which is Heilkunst, right? If we're practicing medical Heilkunst, or you're in Heilkunst treatment, well, what is Heilkunst? We use this word all the time, of course, but especially in this question, I think it's really worth talking about it. So it's a German word, and it's a compound word. It's made up of two more basic words, heilen and Kunst. Heilen is a verb, and Kunst is a noun, right? So the heilen part, the verb part, and this is one of those things where, if you've kind of studied any other language, you've come across this in many forms, right? Where one language has, let's say, one word for something, but then when you go to translate that to the other language, that other language has kind of two different words, and sometimes you use this word, sometimes you use that word, or they're just two different aspects. You have to use this word in this context, and you have to use this word in this other context. So anyways, that's one of the challenges of translation. And so anyways, so heilen, as I said, is the verb in German. And it's when we translate that to English, this kind of brings us back to our starting point. It can really, really divides into these two English verbs. So heilen in German contains both to heal and to cure. Like both of those are kind of implied, and then you kind of make sense of that in German based on the context. Versus in English, we have these two distinct verbs, so to heal and to cure. So in our English mind, this is the distinction we're now making, in this question. So what is the difference in English? There is the difference in German, but again, you have to put the Highland verb into context, and then that difference kind of finds its way out at that level. Let's stay in English. It's obviously going to be easier for this English language video. So to cure and to heal, and particularly in our Heilkunst context, we think about this very, very distinctly. And actually, let me take one other step back here. I'm realizing to frame what I'm about to say. When we use a homeopathic remedy, and that's, of course, by definition, that's based on the law of similars, right? Someone has a particular disease state that we've assessed, we've diagnosed, and so now if we want to give the homeopathic medicine, that's, the question basically is, what is the medicine that has a similar state, very similar state, to the disease. That's where the like cures like comes from. They have to be like, they have to be alike to each other for that law of similars to be taking effect, right? So in this case of the law of similars, giving a medicine, a homeopathic medicine, this is where the word cure comes in. It's already in the phrase that I've used, like cures like. We've already used the verb to cure there. So when we're giving the medicine and we're activating that principle of like cures like, that's that first verb, to cure. The second verb, to heal, is really where we get into the other verb, the other side of the picture here, is healing. And this is where, whereas in curing, that we had that action of the medicine to cure the disease, and that curative action is actually quite rapid, almost instantaneous, right? We usually barely even notice the moment of the cure because it's kind of it's almost like an invisible action. We barely can notice it. Um, the On this other side, where I started to talk about the other verb, to heal, now we get something that does take time. It could be minutes or hours, sometimes even you getting into days and weeks, depending on how deep and complex that disease was. But that healing now, different from the cure, the healing now is the job of the human life force, the healing power, right? Where the cure is kind of almost entirely the job of the medicine. The medicine is acting on the disease that the human being has. That's where the like cures like is acting, through the activity of the medicine. But now we switch to the second verb, to heal, and now we the activity is almost entirely now in the human being, the human living power. And that all of that kind of brings up one more important distinction that Dr. Hahnemann taught us, is when we're talking about the living power, the human living power, the healing power, what is the human being operating on, basically, in health and disease and cure and healing and all these things. Well, what he pointed out was that the human living power has two distinct sides to it. They function together, but we have to kind of conceptually draw a line between what's going on. And the two sides were what he called the generative power and the substantive power. So just like the word sounds, the generative power is that part of the human being that can create something out of nothing, right? So the classic question that children ask their parents sooner or later, where do babies come from? Well, that's kind of a classic example of the generative power. Like there were just two parents, two human beings at one point, but then they come together and now there's a baby. Now there's a third human being. Well, where did that baby come from? Well, again, we can talk about the birds and the bees and everything like that, but in our medical context here, this is a prime example of the generative power, because truly that baby is as if it's kind of come out of nowhere, right? You had no existence and now it has existence. So that one of these profound mysteries of life, where does life come from? Where do babies come from? Well, it comes from, in a sense, it comes from nothing, however we want to say it. It comes from eternity, it comes from God, it comes from the human generative power. Like, we can have a much deeper philosophical exploration of that, but just to illustrate this idea, here we have the generative power. Where does creativity, where do new things come from? The body creates new cells even as it's repairing itself and kind of doing all these processes. And then the other side, the counterpart to the generative power, as I said, is the sustainable power. That's where the body just is constantly in the state of healing and repairing itself and kind of bringing things into balance. But it's not creating anything new. It's just kind of rearranging what is already there. So it might discharge some toxins from the body, or it might move some magnesium from this part of the body to this part which needs it more. Like, it's just kind of rearranging what we already have, and that's the sustainable power. So it's nothing new is being created, but just being rearranged. So all that to say, to wrap up this question of what's the difference between healing and curing, well, I reversed the order there, but the curing is going directly into the generative power. So by definition, a disease has come in and created a kind of a damage to the generative power. So now the medicine, the curative medicine, goes in and repairs that damage, cures the disease, repairs the damage to the generative power, and that kind of initiates our whole Highland process, our whole remedial process, we'd say in English. And then the other side, as I'm saying, the sustaintive power, the healing power, it's now that that disease has been cured, the damage to the life force has been repaired. Now the healing power can do its job. Okay, so anyway, so we get this. I'm kind of going to all these different levels here, but just to kind of get this grander picture, what is the difference between curing and healing? Well, now I think you have a bit more of a sense of that. So, if you have any more questions on that topic, I'm certainly happy to go into that. And as I said at the beginning, if you have any other general questions about Heilkunst in general, about treatment, any of these kind of words that you hear along the way, and well, what does that? You always use this word. What does that mean? Those kinds of questions. Just go ahead and type it into the comment box below. And otherwise, I will see everyone on the next Q&A session. Same time, same place, same format as always. It will be. And yeah, as I say, we will, any questions that come in between now and the next time, I will certainly take those up. Thank you for joining me today, and we will see you all soon.